Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone watching us today. I have three of my favorite friends that I've accumulated over the last decade. For Carey, probably even more than a decade now, Carey. Welcome, Carey, Kyle, and Joel. It's a pleasure to have you on this broadcast. And today we're going to talk generative AI. So I'm going to actually place the first questions to my dear friend Carey. But before I do that, Carey, would you like to take a few minutes or a few seconds to actually introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, sure. I'm Carey Payette, and I've been in the industry a long time, so too many years. It'll show my age if I tell you. But I am an Azure MVP, and I work primarily in the AI and IoT space. So Lino and I go way back, especially in the IoT game. So definite passion for data, for everything AI, and just that's who I am.
That's awesome. It's a pleasure to have you, Carey. Kyle, you want to go next, boss?
Sure. My name is Kyle Bunting. I've been in the industry now for a little over 26 years, so quite a bit of time. Primarily focused on data engineering and the AI space. So working a lot of different AI projects currently, as well as looking at some of the big aspects that we'll talk a little bit about today, as far as structuring the data, getting the data quality where we need it to be in order for Gen AI applications to actually work correctly.
That's awesome. Thank you, Kyle. Joel.
Hey everyone, Joel Hulen, and we're talking about aging ourselves. I've been in the industry for 31 years. You can tell by my hair what's left of it. Like Kyle, we took a similar path in our careers. Spent a lot of it as a developer, but have focused a lot in the cloud and data, and especially AI lately. But a big part of that is data. And we'll talk about that, how data plays a big part in actually having these models make sense, when you ask them questions. So we'll talk about that. Nice to meet everyone.
It is a pleasure, guys. And for me, in case you don't know, I've been in the industry for about 2 weeks now, and my expertise is in Microsoft Bob. All right, let's go ahead and show you the first questions, and I'll go for my dear friend Carey. What is the impact of Gen AI on organizations worldwide nowadays?
All right, so the impacts are actually pretty large scale. So we can talk about, like, for instance, starting with like the customer optics of your company, for instance. So gone are the days where people have to go and sift through things like documentation if they want to find answers about the services and the information that your organization provides. So this really ups the game in the self-service industry, because with generative AI, you could have essentially a bot type or a chat bot be able to interact with that user and still have access to your private information inside your organization. So what I mean is that a lot of the large language models are only trained on public data, but there are different techniques that can be applied that you could retrieve information and data from your systems internally. So by setting up a solution like that, you could actually have like 24/7 support available through your website, for instance, for the consumers of your products or your services to be able to self-service and get those answers. And what's nice is that, it's not just a matter of like providing like a search form, for instance. You would have that conversational experience that tends to improve the customer outlook on your company overall. In addition to that, Joel here, he mentioned data. So data is very important. So when we're talking about Gen AI, it's not just the conversational aspect, even though that is a very good feature of it. But Gen AI with the interactions with your backend systems can really improve your workflows internally. So if you have things where you would definitely want to look up some information in a database, for instance, you can set up a tool to go and be able to have access to different tables in your database and really adhere to ad hoc questions coming in from the system or the user, that needs to retrieve that information. So you don't have to create these one-off applications and figure out, okay, what are the reports that are needed, and then find out, oh, well, we need another report, right? So a lot of this information can be surfaced quite easily with the assistance of Gen AI. And I don't know if, Joel, if you want to add to that.
Yeah. I'll focus on the actual term, Gen AI. What is it generating? That's a big part of it. If you think about things like, I have a little bit of a background in working with data, actually a lot of background working with data. One of the difficulties is, and this comes with a lot of applications, not just model training, but I'll focus on model training. One of the challenges is, hey, I need bank transactions. I need this type of data. I need IoT type of data. And I need to be able to have it be realistic and something I could use to train that model without actually using real account numbers and that kind of thing. So a big lift can come out of just prompting it or showing an example of what you're looking for and guiding it along to the type of information you want to generate and the format that you want. So, that's, I think, a big time saver. Also, that goes with software development too. Now, you can see a lot of the junk that it comes up with as far as code. I've seen junior developers do a lot better job in some cases, but in other cases, it works quite well in accelerating. And the more you use it, the more it kind of picks up on your patterns. And if it has access to your code, it can sort of adopt those as well. So there's a lot of things that help save time on the generative side of things. And I think that's where people kind of get up into arms about, oh, AI is going to take jobs. Kind of like, oh, tractors are going to displace farmers. And, across the spectrum of technological advances, you sort of hear these kinds of things. But really, this does allow you to upskill and reskill your employees, right? To allow them to sort of not focus as much on mundane tasks, but add value in places where Gen AI can't do all the things. Kyle, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I build on that a little bit, right? So touching first on one of the things that both of you talked about is just process automation, right? So we have a lot of redundant, a lot of mundane tasks that organizations, almost every organization has these types of things. Gen AI is a place where we can really leverage those capabilities to start to automate those processes, whether it's data validation, whether it's some workflow, being able to do that. So associated with that, obviously, for most organizations, they're also going to be able to realize significant cost savings when we look at that, right? There's a lot of estimates of pretty massive amounts of cost savings for organizations through the implementation of Gen AI. And then the other piece I think that is important to touch on is that we really talked a little bit about the text generation, the kind of these large language models, but Gen AI is much more encompassing than just those large language models, right? We have things like DALL-E where we can do image generation. We've got video content creation, music composition, all of those types of things. Joel even talked a little bit about data augmentation, data generation, being able to generate synthetic data so that we can do different things as we go through, work with different models, test different scenarios. So there's a lot of value that we can get out of incorporating these models and just improving how organizations go about doing things. Even things as Joel mentioned with code generation, things like GitHub Copilot, some of these other tools that we have out there, they are very powerful. There are times when, as Joel said, you can put in a comment and it will create a code block for you that's exactly what you're looking for, exactly how you would have written it. Other times it does a terrible job. So there's still a lot, and I'll touch on this maybe a little bit more later as we get into some of the other questions here, but just looking at validation of what Gen AI is doing, because the other thing that we see when we look at the impact of this is, I think almost every organization out there is at least curious about how Gen AI can help them, but there is also a lot of distrust in the responses that we get and the things that we're seeing from that. So I think that's an important bit to talk about coming up as well.
That is awesome. Thank you, guys. The next question that I have for you, and this one will go for Joel. Why is it important for an enterprise to get very serious about Gen AI internally and externally, also for their own customers as well?
That is a very good question. Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. I guess I could be flippant and say, well, because everybody else is doing it. But that is actually a really good point. You're looking at one of the most rapid adoptions of a new technology since probably the dawn of the internet is, the capabilities that Gen AI is unlocking for companies is enormous. And so it is almost one of those things where if you don't start doing it, you are going to be left behind by your competitors. And so, yeah, I mean, this is good. You're separating your internal and your external. Internally, this is something Carey had touched on already. But if you have a volume of data about your company, it could be policies, it could be legal stuff, it could be benefits, that type of thing. To be able to read through all that or even reach the appropriate person to ask questions about it isn't always easy. And so internally, it could be used to connect to your knowledge sources and then allow your employees to be able to ask questions about it and reason over it. Beyond that, there's other types of data that you can quickly go through. And we'll talk about RAG and other things about how to augment your own data with it. But to be able to quickly unlock this volume of data, a couple of things that I like to bring up, back when the term was big data, now it's just data because it's all big, is 90% of the data that's generated today is unstructured, not structured like in a database or necessarily your traditional column and row type of tables. There's a lot of unstructured data. Think of like blog posts, think of signals and device information, stuff like that. That's a whole lot of information to go through. And you typically need teams of data engineers. Well, I'm not trying to take jobs away from Kyle and me and others here, but to be able to process that, make sense of it, you still need that. But this also allows you to be able to get through that type of information and unlock those insights. So from an internal thing, and this also goes along with like co-pilots and assistants, to be able to increase your productivity. This is huge. Externally, as far as customers, something else Carey had mentioned is having a chatbot or something for customers to be able to speak to an agent that's knowledgeable about your company and your products, that can ask questions about them without having to have a live assistant. Now, you have to be careful in that you should have some protections in place to say, is the model hallucinating and just making up information to just provide an answer? At what point do you pass someone off to a real person, right? There's things like that you have to think about, but by and large, from a customer standpoint, that's one aspect. There's other things too, where customers can be able to use information that you have available, or you can provide services that maybe you couldn't before, to create interactive charts based upon publicly released data that you put out there, right? Financial data or whatever. There's a whole litany of things. And I think it's important that because all these other corporations are starting to do that, either you will be the disruptor or you'll be disrupted. And you don't want to be in the latter part of that group.
Excellent.
Carey, do you have anything to add to that? Sorry.
Yeah, go for it, Bob. Kyle, Carey, if you would like to add anything to that, or we can go to the next question.
Yeah, I can jump in here real quick. I think there's a couple, maybe just to elaborate a little bit on what Joel said. I think there's two things that really go hand in hand, which from internally for organizations, which is just enhanced productivity. Being able to get these tools in the hands of customers or of employees where it can improve the process. You take even something like a call center where we can now just use AI to summarize a call, versus somebody having to go through, read through that, actually type up a summary. We can now use AI. It's actually very effective at that type of task. So being able to do that where we can just save time in various redundant or repetitive tasks that we're working on. And I think that what goes hand in hand with that is the cost savings that I mentioned before. When we can focus people on getting them away from these mundane tasks and actually shift them over to tasks that add value to the organization, that has a lot of value and benefits for an organization. And then I would just say from a customer perspective, to me, I think it comes down to customer expectations. More and more, we're seeing customers expecting to get these personalized services from corporations, from organizations that they're interacting with, and Gen AI allows us to do that in a very effective manner. Obviously, as Joel said, we need to have controls around that. We need to make sure that the types of responses that we're giving back are measured, that they're directed at what we're trying to do, that they're not giving hallucinogenic answers or false answers to our customers, or making promises to customers that we as an organization can't keep. So we definitely need to control what we're doing there. But this does give us a very critical tool for customer engagement.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Kyle, I'll go with you for the third one. Why does RAG not work sometimes? And what else is available for us that can actually help customers?
Sure. So RAG to start with, right? So retrieval augmented generation is basically a pattern that we use when we're doing generative AI, where we are enhancing the information that the language models have to work with. So they're trained over data on the internet, but those models are not privy to private corporate information, things that we have internally. So with the RAG pattern, what we can do is actually go out and retrieve data from different data stores, whether it's a database, whether it's files, whatever that may be. We can actually go out, query that information, bring it back, and then augment the context that the language model has to reason over when it's formulating a response. So that allows us to introduce private data and then reason over that and respond according to that. There's multiple reasons really why we see RAG falling down at times. A lot of times, I think I'll start with one that I think maybe all of us have mentioned, is just data quality. From a data engineering perspective, it's very important that we improve the quality of our data, that we go through a data cleansing process, as well as even a transformation process to get the data in the right format, the right quality, and the right shape that we need in order to effectively use it when we're returning that back to an LLM. Even how we return it to the LLM, whether we return it in JSON format or just straight text format, tabular format, all of that can play a role in the quality of the types of answers that we get. I think another big factor that we see is just the complexity of data. When we've got a lot of relationships, especially you take something like a SQL database where we have to do multiple joins across tables, that causes some problems. Number one, the language model first has to figure out how to query the database correctly. So it has to understand the relationships between tables, how to retrieve all that information. And then one big problem that we see with that is latency. As we're going through that, we're sitting here potentially running multiple queries against a database to bring the data back for the LLM to use. We're sitting here and we're waiting for all of those things to happen in the background. And then either we do those joins in the database so that we just return that structured data, or we bring different sets of data back and we allow the language model to figure that out. And that's where we see some big problems with RAG, where it just can't figure out the relationships between data. So a lot of different challenges that we run into with that, or even just from a database perspective as well, inefficiencies in data retrieval. We don't have the right indexes on our tables. We don't have the right logic in place to do the joins to figure out what those relationships look like. So that's where we see, I think, RAG doesn't work at times, or it's not as good as we would like it to be. There are some other things that we have. I think this is still very much a work in progress for the industry, but we are starting to see different approaches to this. A lot of times these are used in conjunction, but we may see things like semantic re-ranking, where we actually introduce another machine learning model that allows us to, when we're doing RAG, look at the results that we get back and then actually do a text comparison of the query that was asked over those so that we can re-rank the results and put them into an order that's more semantically similar to the question that was asked, so that the best results are returned from the query that we get there.
And there's a reason why that's important too. Yeah, sorry. I was just going to jump in. There's a reason why that's important. It's because you have a limitation as to how much of that context data you could pass.
Yes.
And if it's not a good match of data, guess what? You might, the model might hallucinate and try to fill in the gaps based on what it's been trained on, which might have nothing to do really with your own data set that you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say the next thing that I would mention here that we can also try is what we're starting to see is GraphRAG. Right, so relying on a graph database and being able to go query that and get back that. So graph databases allow us to really do evaluate relationships between data much more efficiently and faster. The way that those databases are structured, they're designed around entities and the relationships between them. And so being able to query against that also allows us to deal with much more complex data and with much less latency and also just understand those relationships better. So by bringing these things together, we can actually start to really improve the quality and consistency of the responses that we get from the RAG pattern, as well as just overall bring down, hopefully, the amount of data that we're bringing back. I think one other piece here that is a problem across all of the RAG pattern right now is, as Joel was saying, the amount of data that we potentially return. When we're dealing with language models, we have token limitations. So we have to look at what's the size of the prompts that we're sending in, what's the size of the data that we're bringing back from the database, and make sure that we get that down to a point where the language model can reasonably work with that amount of information and get back good responses from it.
I will add something. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Carey.
I was going to say, I think we can safely say that, going back, very long time ago, like 18 months ago, back when RAG was like essentially just a vector store retrieval type format, I think we can say that those days are gone, because we've discovered very early on that vector retrieval falls flat because it does like a nearest neighbor search for relative information within your index, whether that be like in Azure AI search, for instance. But if you have an index that's set up for, we'll say, the Dune books, for instance, and you're asking who is Paul, well, you're going to hit tons and tons and tons of results on that. But the typical pattern that we had early on was that we would say retrieve the closest 5 matches. That eliminates a whole whack of context about Paul. And again, this gets alleviated by what Kyle was talking about, was that if we graph out these entities and these relationships, we could do a prior retrieval through the knowledge graph, find out what relationship is being asked about before we ever get down to our index, if that's the path that we want to go through. Another approach that we've seen that is quite common is adding processing steps within your RAG process. So you will have a request coming in, and instead of just going to the index, grabbing the closest results, like the top 5 results, passing that entire chunk of text, however big that was when you transformed it, sticking that into the context window, what you can do is enable the use of a smaller model, for instance. So even though your main model might be like GPT-4o, for instance, you can have those retrievals be I'm going to use re-ranking lightly here, but you can have that analyzed or summarized, so you can actually retrieve the chunk, summarize it in the context of the question coming in by GPT-4o Mini, and then just send that smaller summary into the context window going up to GPT-4o for that answer. So there's tons and tons of really exciting things happening in this space. So GraphRAG is one, LightRAG is another. Another one that I'm really excited about is one called PathRAG. So a lot of things happening in this space, but really I think there's a lot to be gained by the systems implementer having some control over how the information is gathered, how the importance of that information is structured, how it's summarized. And I think that will go a long way into the future as a common pattern, instead of just doing like a direct database call or a direct Azure AI search call, like having that intermediary smaller model doing some work for you because it's cheaper and it's faster, and it can really condense the size of that token burn for those larger models. I think that you're going to see a lot of that going forward.
Excellent. The one thing I was going to say is that a lot of times people are used to RAG because they go to conferences or they see a video on YouTube, and people are usually doing vectorization on 1 or 2 documents, and everything works well. But in real life, and I know the 4 of us are involved with these projects where a financial company or insurance company has 250,000 documents that they need to vectorize. This is when RAG actually, we call it the naive RAG, right? And the graph comes in because it creates these nodes and communities on top of all the 250,000, so that you can have a real meaning to understand the relationship between all of these files. So again, when it's 5, 10 documents, it's not, in the real life scenario, it's not really what enterprise level customers are looking for to be able to accomplish that. And whether it's Neo4j or LightRAG, or even something that is still in the labs for Microsoft, like GraphRAG, all of that stuff will continue to evolve to get it to a point where it's a lot smarter, a lot better, cost effective in the future as well.
Yeah, and just real quick on that, I would say, for a lot of organizations, looking at how do we combine these different patterns. They're all variants of RAG, right? We're obviously augmenting, but how do we bring these things together to take advantage of each one for the benefits and the advantages that it has, where we can try to steer clear of some of the weaknesses that each one also has.
Excellent. All right, we have 2 more questions. This question coming in is for Carey. How can healthcare or financial companies, whether it's insurance or banking and so on, can be confident in the security of their data when working with Gen AI? Nobody wants to be in the news on CNN, right? So how do we actually be able to provide that knowledge and that confidence for these companies?
It's everybody's favorite word. It's governance. So really what you really have to do as an organization is really take ownership over your data, your policies, the policies could be security policies. It could be it could, you really just have to focus on taking control over everything. So there's ways of interacting with large language models where, like, for instance, you don't have to send data over the public internet. Right. So a lot of times what we'll see is we'll go into an organization that's fairly green in a Gen AI space, and they're, hitting OpenAI over the public internet constantly and sending their information over the public internet, which really opens yourself up to like man-in-the-middle attacks and things like that. So from an infrastructure perspective, it makes sense to essentially have a service that would be private to your own internal network and be able to work with a large language model that is dedicated for your installation of your solution. So this, like in the Azure space, for instance, would be like an express route tunnel, and you could use private endpoints between services and things like that. But from a higher level perspective, like we talked a lot about, like, for instance, having database connectivity, like having some type of tool that would do database queries for you, for instance. But let's say you have like an HR system and you have a tool in place that knows about the database schema of your HR system. Somebody comes in and says, well, how much does the CEO make? And that's kind of proprietary information that you don't have distributed. So what you have to really make sense of is making sure that when you're designing the system, that different people have access to only what they need to have access to and don't have anything access to anything above and beyond that. So that goes from service accounts as well as individual contributor accounts as well. So from a system account, obviously, like if it's an HR database and you have this tool that's writing queries, you want to make sure that that service principal that database is using doesn't have the ability to drop tables or create tables or do any data manipulation whatsoever. So any DML statements should be out of the question. Should be just retrieval from, a subset of tables that you specifically give it access to. And you can do that at the database level. And of course, through prompt engineering, you can make sure that you steer that the prompt, you can steer that functionality to just those tables. Another thing is definitely like document access. So it works the same way as data access in the database. Again, there's certain documents that would be considered confidential, for instance. And even though you might have an AI system that has access to all of the CMSs and the documents that you have in your CMS, you want to make sure that the person calling in has the permissions to whatever is being retrieved. So all of that comes down to a system design, and that's definitely something that you want to have control over. Same thing goes again down to that infrastructure level, that you want to make sure that the people the people that are using the system, like for instance on an internal system, that all that communication is done privately, and then through ExpressRoute, again, you have that private networking connection, and the deployments in Azure are specifically for your organization. So that is one way to make sure that you remain confident in your security.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. Plus, I would like to add something. I know the four of us are working on a lot of different projects that have security at the top of mind, which is the fact is there are different kind of security. There is a data source security, and there is the index security, and the access to the agent security. There's a lot of different things. So if I have a lot of documents, let's say 1,000 documents in an Azure data lake, or in an Amazon S3 bucket, or you name it, you just have these files available somewhere, maybe in SharePoint. Maybe Joel can only access 10 of these files, not all 1,000. Maybe Kyle have access to only 20 of them that are different than the 10. When I go do the vectorization, how am I going to limit the access to your data source to the same index that you're allowed to see? Otherwise, you should not be getting answers from that index that was based on a data source. So all of the stuff is a system engineering. This is not something that will come out of the box. That it requires definitely experience and understanding of the security models and the RBAC and the PBAC for policies to be able to set all the stuff correctly. Kyle and Joe, would you like to add anything to that part about the healthcare and the fintech companies with security?
Yeah, I think you guys covered pretty much everything from a system standpoint, but there's also other things to think about. Think about compliance. You know, that's very important, especially if you're in fintech, if you're in healthcare. You need to make sure that all the infrastructure stuff that we talked about, including the services that host these models, do ensure certain levels of compliance, or the combination of your configurations help abide by these compliance regulations. The other thing too is being able to do things like tokenize and mask sensitive information. So if there is a chance that some information can come back out, like a social security number or a credit card number or something, that there is a way to obfuscate that, to mask that information so it does not get out there if it does need to go back to that user legitimately, right? That they have access otherwise to that information. I think that's also very important. And then the other thing I was thinking of too is there's this idea of guardrails, you know, and content filtering. It's what are the levels of protection that you want to put around the content, either of what users are asking of the model to do, or the type of information the model is generating, right? Like it could be something, everything from don't generate malicious code to don't, you know, return back any sort of risque type of information or whatever, right? Like things that people might find objectionable. There's a whole spectrum of things in that area of content filtering and guardrails that also apply.
That is excellent. Very cool. Well, I have one last question for you. And that is there a way to stop model hallucination completely in Gen AI? I get these questions a lot. For some reason, companies are very worried that the model is going to hallucinate. Is there a way to lock it down to never hallucinate? I'll actually pass that to you, Joel. Go ahead and take that one.
Never is a very strong word. Only the Sith deal in absolutes. So if you were to say never hallucinate, then no. There are ways to help prevent it from hallucinating. But when it comes down to it, these large language models are non-deterministic. You know, you can ask the same question 3 or 4 times, and you might get either slight variations of the same answer, or you can get something completely different. And a lot of that has to do with things that we already talked about in providing it the valid context. If you're doing a RAG sort of pattern, making sure that the information that you're getting based on the question is relevant to the answer that the agent needs to provide. And that agent is going to look at that context and say, okay, I'm going to try to answer in a human-friendly sort of way, right? But there are certain things that you could do to help prevent it from getting too creative. You know, one is as simple as there's a temperature control in a lot of these models as to, 0 to 1 usually, 1 being the most creative, to 0 being basically Joe Friday, just the facts man. I'm just going to try to answer this as straight as I can without embellishing or anything like that, right? But a big part of it, it's really about the data. Some of it is about maybe some prompt engineering. Other things are, Kyle touched on it already, where you might have these sort of like chain RAG kind of patterns or React patterns where you initially do a RAG type of pattern in order to get the contextual data, but then maybe you call out to a service to fact check that data, right? Or something like that, just to make sure that the final context that you're sending to that model is actually accurate and factual. And then hopefully the model won't try to inject additional information it thinks might be what you want to hear, right? So those are just some ideas that I have off the top of my head.
Yeah, definitely exactly what you said there. That's like the multi-agent approach. So in talking like Autogen, I'm looking at you right now, and I guess that's ingested now into semantic kernel, is you could have like that supervisor type agent that does exactly what you just said, Joel. It's taking a look at what is coming back from its underlings, if you will. And so that's really important. At the end of the day, though, too, is like one of our friends taught me something is what you want to do is always have to treat an AI like a drunken intern. So that was from our friend Kevin Fiesel, and that's stuck in my mind because it's so true. It's so true.
Sounds like something Kevin would say.
Yes. I use it all the time.
That's great.
My joke number 2 is from Kevin. But anyway, what I was trying to get at here is that you do need to be careful again on like what the context window size is, because the larger the context window, and you touched on this again earlier, is that the more information and instruction and content that is in those context windows, it tends to get lost. So if you take a look at it and think, okay, would an intern read through all of that text and adhere to every single rule that I've specified in that text? Chances are it's like, no, they need the too long don't read, like TLDR, right? They need it more condensed. So you might even want to use GPT-4 Mini to even condense that and send it back. Yeah. So again, you do have to definitely provide like evaluation metrics over time. So what you should be doing is storing again these exchanges and evaluating your model's performance, or I shouldn't say your models, evaluating your agent and your prompts performance at every tool level, at every agent level, to make sure that things are working the way that they expect. Because over time, as the models changes, different models behave differently for different things. You want to make sure that you're keeping track of that you're versioning things so that you have ways to roll back if things go south. So a lot of different processes that need to be in place in the development of a Gen AI system.
I have to say also regarding the hallucination, sometimes I go read some of the comments on different forums, whether it's Microsoft or AWS or Google, and I see answers like people are asking, how can I actually eliminate hallucination? And people will say what Joel just said, just set temperature to 0. Well, no. If you set temperature to 0, you're not guaranteed you're not going to get hallucination. So that's a misconception in the industry as well. I mean, if you can actually set temperature to 0 and then eliminate hallucination, then you're not using Gen AI, you're using an if statement. It's a very large if statement at that point. So the deterministic is what Joel said, that is the key of the game as well. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in there too, because I think one of the, from an organizational perspective and using these models, one of the key things is really understanding the models that you're using and what their capabilities are. We see it all the time. These models are horrible if you ask them about dates. They base their dates on their training date. So they may tell you that it's 2 years ago. So being able to augment them with the correct information about the current date, things that we're working with. They're also terrible at math, right? We can ask them to do mathematical calculations, compared to people's ages, what's 1 + 1. It may or may not give you the correct answer. They are not designed to do those types of things, but we see people attempting to use the models for exactly that. So understanding the capabilities of the model, and then understanding where, from a solution perspective, we need to set that model up so that it will call out to another tool. Maybe we're running, a Jupyter notebook to actually run Python code and do those calculations, so that we're not relying on the model to do the calculations. We're actually giving it the result of those calculations. So making sure that when we're leveraging these things, that we actually understand it. The Hulen model, it very much hallucinates.
Yeah, oh, go ahead.
So really just looking at that, and I think some of this the hallucination aspect also comes down to the models themselves, how they're being trained, the data that they're being trained on. And from an organizational perspective, understanding those aspects of that, understanding when it is that we actually need to have humans engaged, evaluating the responses that we're giving, modifying prompts, doing the tweaks that we need in order to manipulate how that comes back. And even prompt engineering, we hear a lot about prompt engineering. We also hear a lot about prompt engineering going away because the models themselves can generate very good prompts. But we also do need to understand that prompts are not the end-all answer. We can have instructions in a prompt, and as Carey said, if you get way too much context there, the model may just completely ignore what you have in that prompt because you've given it way too much to deal with. So understanding how we can manipulate those things where we need to, and how we leverage the various tools that we have, I think is an important aspect.
Yeah, I was just going to say, another part of it is setting the proper expectations for your users. You see it if you go to ChatGPT. In the footer, it says something like, ChatGPT can make mistakes, effectively don't take it as the gospel truth. And that's true. I mean, that's why that goes back to the point. You cannot completely eliminate it. So people just need to treat these as assistants, not the absolute truth. You can see examples of services like Bing Copilot has citations. And so you can see, oh, these are the links where I can click on it and look at the search results. So then I can go and check the sources for myself and be able to reliably or confidently say, okay, yeah, this is the right answer. Or you can do something, I think, Kyle, you had mentioned it, or maybe you did, Carey, something to the effect of providing an option for your user to verify an answer. So then you can start getting that user-driven validation that can go back to making improvements in your system that you're building and providing your customers.
Guys, this has been a lot of fun for me. I hope we can do it again soon and talk about very specialized conversation going forward. But I want to thank you all for joining me today. It has been a pleasure, and have a great one. Thanks, guys.
All right. Thank you, Lino. Cheers.
Bye.